So I will just say welcome to everyone. I'm Krista Thompson, and this is OCOW's second week of our annual October and Beyond series focusing on occupational diseases. Okay. This is, as I said, our second session. We have a total of 5 sessions going through November. Every Thursday, we will have the session from in Eastern Time, 12 to 1:30. And we are recording, so it is if you are answering a question or asking a question rather, you are welcome at the end of each presentation to do so, but you will be recorded when you do it. If you don't wish to be recorded, you can still ask a question by putting it in the chat. So for today's session, we have 3 segments with 4 speakers. We have John Lee, who will be up first in just a moment. We have Chris Sheppard, and we have Madison Seloff and Lena Paul. So as I said, John will be first. John is Acting Strategic Advisor Development at the Ontario Ministry of Labour, Immigration, Training and Skills Development's High Hazard Unit. John has a Master's of Health Science from U of T, is a certified industrial hygienist, a registered occupational hygienist, and a Canadian registered safety professional. He has extensive experience assessing regulatory compliance in a wide range of industrial, construction, commercial, healthcare, educational work environments, having been an occupational hygienist prior to his current role. So welcome, John. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Krista. So I want to start off by asking everybody a question. And it's a rhetorical question, so don't worry, there's no QR code or Slido to worry about. If WHMIS training was not mandatory, how interested do you think your workers would be in doing it? And then think about something you're interested in or something you see as very relevant to you. It's not quite the same feeling, is it? So, good morning, everybody, or at this point it's noon. Like Krista said, my name is John Lee, and I'm a strategy advisor with the Prevention Division at the Ministry of Labour, Immigration, Training and Skills Development. And here I lead the occupational illness portfolio in the high hazard unit, where I advocate for initiatives that help to prevent occupational illness. And what's led me to this work is that by training, as Krista mentioned, I am an occupational hygienist. I have been for the last 16 years. And for the last 11 of those years, I was a field hygienist at the ministry in the enforcement division. So in Ontario, the hygienists are also appointed as inspectors under the Act. And so I've physically visited thousands of different workplaces in all the different sectors, enforcing the Act and regulations, issuing orders and investigating complaints, injuries, illnesses, and fatalities. So I've spent a lot of time observing and thinking about how workers use hazardous products. I've seen spray paint on the worker's face and their hands. I've brushed dust off of even my own safety vest when I'm at the workplace, and I've smelled that smell of solvent, xylene, toluene in the air, knowing that this is what workers are exposed to. And I think that we can really leverage the expertise within the OHS system to help workplaces do better to help prevent their workers from getting occupational illnesses. So today, I'm only here for a few minutes, but I'm happy to give everybody a very small update about a project that I'm leading related to WHMIS that aims to better engage workers when it comes to preventing occupational illness. So right now, the 6 health and safety associations are working together with the ministry as a system to create a voluntary WHMIS learning curriculum. And this resource aims to provide guidance to workers, employers, and trainers on 3 key areas: desired learning outcomes, so workers have a solid foundation; effective training delivery methods to better engage those workers in their own learning process; and possible worker evaluation techniques so that the workers can demonstrate and apply the knowledge that they've learned through the learning process. This work is an effort to implement one of the key recommendations in the Occupational Disease Landscape Review Report, which was released from the MAP Center for Urban Health Solutions in 2023. And that report had 41 different recommendations to improve worker health through better prevention, better monitoring, better healthcare delivery, and better integration between the OHS system and the healthcare system. I want to clarify that since this is a voluntary learning curriculum, that this resource will not change an inspector's discretion when they are enforcing the WHMIS regulation when they visit your workplace. And it also doesn't change the current CPO approved working at heights or Joint Health and Safety Committee certification, how that's administered. So I wanted to make sure that was clear for everybody. And the last thing I'll mention is that our target launch window is April 2026, when we want this resource to be released through the health and safety system partners. So that's what I wanted to share today. Only wanted to take this time to give you a little update about what we're working on here at the ministry along with our system partners, because at the end of the day, we're all stronger together. We're all on the same page. As a hygienist, I know that we have a lot of expertise throughout the system that we want to leverage. And so I'm committed to making this resource something that will help make WHMIS training more engaging, more relevant, and more focused on preventing occupational illness. And that's what I wanted to share with everybody. So I really appreciate everybody following along with me, and thanks a lot for your time.
Okay, thank you so much, John. That's your first question really hit the nail on the head there. I definitely have been, I've had a number of employers before OCal, and the training was done very differently at each employer. Same outcome, but very, very different training. And some of them were really well done, and some were very much a chore to get through. So doing that.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So we do have a question that I don't think can be answered at this time. Just if you'll be adopting a system like the WorkSafe BC Exposure Registry Program. I don't think that's within your mandate or department, is it?
Yeah, that's not something that I'm able to comment on right now. Really, my hope was to keep this group involved. I'm very familiar with the Occtober series. I know many of the members who participate in this, and so I wanted to keep people involved. At the same time, there are still a lot of things that we are developing, and so I hope everybody will stay tuned. And
yeah, April 2026 is not far away.
Yeah.
Thank you again, John. So I'm going to go to our next speaker now, and I believe this morning I got things up. I wrote it down. I hope I'm looking in the right spot. We're going to Chris Sheppard. Did I get this right? Excellent. I see
That's the order I know.
Okay, good. So Chris is a registered occupational hygienist and Canadian registered safety professional with the Nova Scotia Department of Labour, Skills and Immigration in the Occupational Health and Safety Division. He has a Master's of Science in Chemistry and has been in the occupational health and safety and occupational hygiene field since 2000. Prior to starting with the division, he worked in various occupational health and safety roles in acute care, retail, and post-secondary education. In addition to regular compliance and enforcement duties with the division, Chris is also the Nova Scotia Provincial WHMIS Coordinator. So Chris is here today to speak about the WHMIS system, which has been legislation in Canada since 1988. It's a core component of safety program in almost every industry. So as we alluded to with John a moment ago, it can be implemented very differently in many different ways. So Megan Friesen and I invited Chris here today to talk a bit more about WHMIS.
Okay, thank you very much, Krista, for the introduction. I am going to actually stop my video now, if folks don't mind, because I'm a little worried about my connection at the moment. And just let me share my screen. Okay, Krista, or if someone could confirm you've got, you can see my presentation and it's
I can
correct
see
screen?
it. I can see it with the viewer's notes right now.
Okay, how's that?
That's great.
Perfect. All right. Once again, thank you very much for taking the time to come and listen to me talk about WHMIS for a little while. I wanted to, I guess, first of all, start off with saying what John said right there at the beginning about WHMIS training really hit the note with me as well. It's He's speaking about something that you will hear me speak about a little bit as part of this presentation, about, you know, what are some of the things we need to do, go kind of to make WHMIS effective and to make it more meaningful in the workplace. So it's really good to hear that there's many more than me just thinking about that. So before I actually get into the presentation itself, well, first of all, I do work for the Department of Labor Skills and Immigration, Government of Nova Scotia, but just to be clear that this presentation are my opinions and my views and not necessarily the views of the Government of Nova Scotia. I understand that certainly most everyone on this call is probably in Ontario. I will be speaking mostly from a national perspective, but every now and then I'll have to slip into specifics for provincial matters. I will tend to default to the Nova Scotia experience around that. So just bear with me if it's a little bit different than your own. I am a compliance officer as well. So in some respects, I'm approaching this matter from a compliance perspective, but I also have 15 plus years of health and safety experience in the trenches, so to speak, before this. So I'm able to see both sides of the problem and hopefully be able to talk to both of those. The last matter, anyone who read the abstract, I will apologize now, as is usually the case when you're asked to do one of these presentations. What you thought would make a good discussion at the beginning doesn't necessarily match what ends up in the PowerPoint presentation. I am going to touch on many of the points in that abstract, but it may be weighted a little bit different than originally proposed. So what exactly am I going to be talking about today? First of all, WHMIS, what is it? And I know all of you on this call have experience with WHMIS, have probably done WHMIS training, have dealt with WHMIS in the workplace. So this isn't intended to be an in-depth review or anything like that. Just to set the tone, set the stage for the rest of the discussion, and put WHMIS in its proper context, for lack of a better way of putting it. After that, I just want to get into why is WHMIS important? And again, John touched a little bit on that in his introduction. It is very much there as a preventative measure to prevent workplace illness and injury. Very straightforward. But I wanted to go into a little more depth about that is in terms of, again, putting that in context of how important is it, why, historically, why is it important, and what are the sorts of things that WHMIS is intended to deal with in the workplace. Of course, all systems have their problems. So that is, from there, I'd like to go into, well, WHMIS is good. WHMIS does have its issues, both in its form, I think in some cases, and in its implementation. So I wanted to discuss some of those issues and then follow up at the end with, well, what can you do about it as the employer, as the employee, as someone in the workplace, maybe as someone in a position where things can be made to change. I just want to touch a little bit on that as well. Okay, so what is WHMIS? This definition comes courtesy of our good friends at the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety. So WHMIS stands for the Workplace Hazardous Material Information System. It is a comprehensive system for providing health and safety information on hazardous products intended for use, handling, and storage in Canadian workplaces. WHMIS is aligned with the Worldwide Hazard Communication System known as GHS, the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals. Again, I suspect that is not information to anyone on this call. But I just wanted to highlight some of the parts of that definition, and those are the parts in red. So it is intended to be comprehensive. And in fact, I would argue that it's comprehensive, but it's also meant to be standardized. So the information you're getting in Ontario is the same as the information here in Nova Scotia, is the same as the information in BC, and so on. And it is the information, it is a system to provide that health and safety information to the workplace to allow safe work of those products. And not only is it a comprehensive and a standardized system across Canada, now with the linking into the global harmonized system, that brings us into standardization with the rest of the world. So again, all the information should be aligned across all those jurisdictions that have adopted the GHS to make that sharing of information much more useful. WHMIS was, of course, in the form that we initially had, the WHMIS 1988 was primarily a Canadian-based system, but certainly with alignment with the US. But since 2015, we have come in alignment with much of the rest of the world through GHS. So WHMIS is, it's certainly, as was originally envisioned, as originally developed in the 80s for Canada, was a tripatriot kind of agreement between federal government, provincial governments, and labor. Labor is certainly still part of this role, but for the sake of simplicity, I've left it as a tripatriot system, but we've brought GHS into the mix here. So GHS it's a global system administered by the United Nations, and it is used to define the classification of hazardous products, as well as standardized tools for communication, such as formatting of safety data sheets, symbols, hazard and precautionary statements, and so on. It's not enforceable until it has been adopted by a jurisdiction. So Canada adopted GHS in 2015 to form the basis of WHMIS under the Hazardous Product Act and the Hazardous Product Regulations, the federal regulations. Those federal regulations are aimed primarily at the suppliers of hazardous products, the manufacturers, the importers, and it is administered through the federal government through Health Canada. The third part of that, of course, is the provincial aspect, and that is where the provincial authorities are implementing and enforcing WHMIS in the workplace. So that is looking at how it is used in the workplace in terms of the training, the education, availability of information, and so on. Of course, Canada being Canada, we have 13 different federal, provincial, and territorial jurisdictions. We all have our own WHMIS regulations. Some are standalone. Some will be part of an omnibus OSH regulation. The nice thing about WHMIS, because of that, it's been a joint effort all along. All of those regulations are remarkably similar. Not exact. We all have our slightly different takes on it, but they're all based on a model regulation that was developed as part of the WHMIS process. So what I speak to today, that may be from a Nova Scotia specific perspective, 90 to 95% of that is going to be applied to any jurisdiction. So one of the things with WHMIS is it's frequently considered it's just a thing, and it's always been the thing, and it always will be that thing. To some extent, that's true. It is based on regulation. Regulation typically does not change very often. Those of us who work in the regulatory realm understand that as much as anyone, or probably more than anyone. But there have been changes, of course. The original WHMIS, as I alluded to earlier, 1988 has transitioned to what we've called WHMIS 2015 with the adoption of the global harmonized system. There is, of course, provincial regulation updates, and again, with that switch to the 2015 system, we all had to go through that process to update our provincial regulations to match with the new reality. Given the inclusion of GHS, that introduces even more chance for change here. So GHS is updated every 2 years. The 11th revised edition, as if I remember correctly, has just been published in October. We actually adopted here in Canada in 2015 the 5th revised edition. More recently, we've adopted another revised edition, the 7th, with some pieces from the 8th. So there is that process there to make continuous improvement and continuous change to the structure of WHMIS. Now, those changes adopted recently in 2022, they're not large. That's a matter of changing details, changing some of the hazard classes, some of the definitions, and so on. But that change is still there. From the perspective of the workplace and protecting workers in the workplace, the other thing to keep in mind is, while the structure of WHMIS may not change a lot or change very often, the information under WHMIS can and should change fairly often. There is a requirement under WHMIS regulations that whenever significant new information about a hazardous product is becomes known, that information has to be updated on SDS, updated on labels, depending on your jurisdiction, may require informing the workers in the workplace in a set period of time that information has changed. We've been using this chemical for years. Oh no, now we know it's a carcinogen. That information has to go to the people who need to know it. That is probably the biggest significant thing that can and should be changing with WHMIS on a fairly regular basis. So what I want to talk now is, that's the what is WHMIS. Just want to touch a little bit on why is WHMIS important. So chemical labeling is a big piece of WHMIS. Issues with chemical labeling is not new, and I've got to say this is probably one of the few times that WHMIS has crossed paths with my interest outside of work in history. Just by happenstance, happened to come across this reference in a book I was reading a few weeks ago. Labeling problems are not new. 1945, the height of the Second World War, the United States Medical Services had discovered there were issues with their with how they were providing treatment, because their oxygen cylinders were painted green. If they were receiving British supplies, the green cylinders in British supply were carbon dioxide. As it mentions here, that ended up with a few deaths on the operating table. Not exactly labeling, but it's definitely information transfer, providing the proper information, making sure standardization to protect everyone in the workplace. And unfortunately, we still run into issues with chemical labeling. This is a case recently out of New Brunswick last year. I won't read this in full detail, but just direct your attention to the highlighted part. So this was a situation where an individual was providing a chemical sample to an employer, to a workplace. They brought it in a bottle that was not properly labeled, was not WHMIS labeled. It was in an incorrect bottle. It was actually in a wine bottle, in which the original label had not been fully defaced. And unfortunately, somebody thought that it might have been a drinkable product, and it unfortunately was not. And it ended up with a prosecution for the individual involved, and some health effects for the poor individual who did try drinking it. So issues with labeling, also issues with classification. This gets back a little bit to more the, why tie into a global system like GHS. So for example, prior to standardization around GHS, we could be talking about something flammable, but depending on who's doing the speaking, your flammability may not be the same as my flammability. So for example, much of my work career was involved in the acute care healthcare sector. We used 10% formalin a lot in the labs for preservation of tissue and so on. If you look at a safety data sheet for formalin, the flash point, depending on the source of the information and the exact concentration, is typically somewhere around 200 Fahrenheit. So if you look at that chart, 200 is kind of the cutoff point for where most systems at one time would have considered something to be combustible. Beyond that, it would not have been combustible. But if you look at the NFPA one, they go beyond that. So I would find myself frequently in conversations with the fire safety officer, and we'd be talking across purposes, because he would be relying on an NFPA definition. I'd be relying on, at the time, mostly the old WHMIS definition, or even now more the GHS definition. Same problem. In his case, he considered it combustible. From a WHMIS perspective, not necessarily. And you can get into that even from the from a flammability to combustibility range. So, for example, cyclohexanone, feedstock in nylon production, it's a flash point of about 110 Fahrenheit. That would be combustible under WHMIS, under GHS. Would be combustible under the old WHMIS and under NFPA. Under GHS, it would be considered flammable. So confusion. What are we talking about? How can we compare apples to apples in this case? A similar situation here with a chemical with a particular LD50. Depending on the jurisdiction prior to GHS, it could be defined by any number of different number of terms, going from toxic all the way down to non-toxic. How can we have a meaningful conversation if we can't even keep our words right? Non-toxic in this situation will mean something different to me than somebody else in a different jurisdiction. And then finally, so we tend to sometimes think about WHMIS as just a paperwork process, and I'll touch a little more on that, but it has real life consequences. And just to illustrate, this is an incident that was here in Nova Scotia some years ago now, 2008, local auto body shop. They had a terrible explosion, and they had a young worker die. And the investigation and the court process kind of uncovered that a lot of what was going on here was simply their use of flammable chemicals in the workplace was not in compliance with the information available on, at that time, the material safety data sheet. There was inadequate labeling, and it also turned out the individual had never been properly trained in the workplace about how to deal with all this, and unfortunately ended in a loss of life. Oops. In terms of some statistics, we have this national system for safety for hazardous products, for chemical products. How big of an issue is exposure to hazardous products in the workplace? And these are some statistics that come from the Association of Workers' Compensation Boards of Canada. If you're a statistics nerd, it's not a bad place to go. Hundreds and hundreds of pages of charts and numbers telling you about what WCB is told across the country in terms of incidents. So what you can see, so this shows the fatalities over a period of 3 years, 2021, 22, and 23, across all jurisdictions. First of all, just acknowledge, not all of these are going to be what I'd say WHMIS specific issues. There's going to be a lot of occupational health type issues, so asbestos exposures, firefighter presumption, and so on in here. But it gives a picture of what's going on. So we're looking fairly consistently at anywhere between mid-60s to mid-70s fatalities every year over those 3 years across Canada. And just to explain why the min-max ranges, the way the statistics are reported, if there's less than 3 reported under a particular category, it's not given an exact number, and that's for privacy purposes. So if you know there's only been 1 incident of this type in a certain jurisdiction, you could find it could lead to identifying the person involved. So they genericize the numbers a bit. In terms of lost time claims, we see a couple of one interesting thing. We see, interestingly, the numbers again are fairly consistent. The percentages are fairly consistent across the country. You'll also notice that the actual claim numbers are much, the percentage is much less for a lost time claim than it is for a fatality. There are, I'm sure, lots of complex reasons for that, relating to underreporting and so on, which I will touch a bit on the next slide. But also, does that tell us something about exposure to hazardous products in the workplace? Does that suggest that maybe there is a tendency to a high risk exposure there in many cases, because we're seeing our proportion of fatalities that are caused by chemical products are higher than the number of incidents, the number of lost times caused by hazardous products. And just to illustrate that in one other way, this information comes from a good report from Dr. Sean Tucker at the University of Regina. He issues a report every year looking at workplace fatalities and injury rates across Canada. And again, it's a good summary of WCB data and looking at the limitations and so on. And I appreciate I'm talking to an OCal audience here, so you are probably reporting of occupational disease information is probably known to many of you. But what the interesting thing, again, to look at here is the fatality rate due to occupational disease. And again, I appreciate that not all of those are directly related to WHMIS, but occupational disease tends to trump occupational injuries. in terms of fatalities across Canada. And that's the same for all jurisdictions, and just for illustration purposes, showing Ontario and Nova Scotia in this case. Our numbers here in Nova Scotia are a little more jagged. That is quite simply a statistical issue with the size of our population. When you're reporting for 100,000 and you don't have that many, that large of a base number to start from, tends to make your numbers jump around a little bit. So back to the comments about the lost time claims and the fatalities. One of the issues, of course, with when you're dealing with WCB data is underreporting. Indications from this report from Dr. Tucker is long-term claims can be lost time claims. Sorry, could be underreported by anywhere from 30 to 50%, depending on your jurisdiction and the study. Fatalities tend to be underreported, particularly occupational disease fatalities, because frequently as we all know, the lag time from the exposure to the fatality can be quite large, and if it's not properly recognized as occupational in the moment, it just doesn't get reported. Okay, so that touches on, very briefly, what is WHMIS? Why is WHMIS important? What is it intended to do? What are the problems, so to speak, that it's intended to fix? Well, now I just want to talk a little bit about why maybe WHMIS doesn't work as well as it does sometimes. What are the issues with it? And I've broken these down into some general categories. There's a regulatory issue here, so there are issues with the way that the WHMIS regulations, both federally and provincially, are written, that not everything is covered, and the other issue being, because of the subject matter we're dealing with, the information is complex. It may be standardized, but it is still complex and difficult to implement. In terms of the implementation, this gets a little back again into what John was talking about at the beginning, about making training effective, making it memorable. That's part of it. WHMIS training isn't always effective. WHMIS education is not always effective. Information is not always clear when it's provided, even when it's provided on the SDS and the label, may not always be accurate. And WHMIS has a tendency to be seen as a one and done. You go in, you do your training, you get a certificate, you walk away, you're done. Again, it's part of a complex issue with occupational health and safety issues in general, where it's not an integrated part of kind of how we do business. So first of all, exemptions. This is the list that comes from our Nova Scotia WHMIS, part of our WHMIS regulation, and just talking about what is covered under WHMIS and what is not. And I'm not going to go into detail on this, but just to illustrate, the points in green, those are ones that are essentially completely exempt from WHMIS. The ones in red are partially exempt, and the ones in black are exempt, but with some funny requirements. What I want to focus on is some of the ones in red. So those are ones that are exempt from the requirements for a safety data sheet or a supplier label. So they'll be and that's primarily because they are already covered under other jurisdictions, under other regulations. So the idea was you didn't want to kind of double up on regulation by imposing WHMIS on those as well. So the problem comes, the expectation under provincial and territorial regulation is those items may be exempt from the federal aspects, so from the labeling and the SDS aspects, but you still have to train your workforce on how to use those properly. If there's no requirement for a safety data sheet or for a proper supplier label on those products, that makes it difficult to train employees how to use those products safely. That's not to say there isn't information available under some of these, under these other pieces of legislation, but is it consistent with WHMIS? Is it necessary? Does it cover as much information as WHMIS does? There's the potential for confusion. There's the potential for not getting things right because we have these parallel systems. And just to illustrate, I'm going to pick on consumer products for a minute. Two different examples here. The one on your left is a standard WHMIS label from a standard laboratory chemical supply house. You'll have to take my word for it. You can't see the other side label, but it hits all the details of what you need on a WHMIS supplier label. The other one is a consumer product pulled off of a shelf, Home Depot, and it is for the same product. Methyl hydrate is methanol, just two different types of terminology. You look at the labels. Okay, let's look at our pictograms here. Flammable on the consumer, flammable on the WHMIS. We've got the skull and crossbones there on both of them. And then you have this other one on WHMIS. What does that mean? Why is that different from consumer? Again, confusion. Which label is the right one? Which one is the one that provides the information that you need to use in the workplace? The issue with consumer labeling, of course, is it's designed for short-term. It provides information on short-term exposure. You know, your average person in the household is not going to be using this chemical product a lot, so they may just be concerned about the short-term effects. If you're working with it day in, day out in the workplace, then you have concerns about chronic effects. So that is why that extra symbol is there on the WHMIS label. That's the risk of longer term systematic effects that you might not worry about under consumer legislation. And then it gets even more confusing when you get into a product, in this case, where they've included both labels. I apologize for the fuzzy picture, but this was taken standing in a Home Depot. But you can see on the left-hand side again, that is a WHMIS label. On the right-hand side, that's a consumer label. That is both sides of the same container. Who's regulating this? What label should you be paying attention to? What does it mean? What do the differences mean? Again, confusion, not clear. And then we get into issues where there are products that, in terms of how they're regulated through WHMIS, fall through the cracks. And two examples I'll provide here is welding wire and engineered stone, which we'll hear a lot about very shortly. Both of these products, I think no one would argue that they present a risk in the workplace. The welding fume is a well-known hazard. Respirable silica from working with engineered stone is a well-known hazard. But because WHMIS is intended to apply to a product as it is sold, they don't necessarily get classified in the same way. They aren't classified as the high hazard products that they are because of the form they're in when they're sold. And complexity of information. I have a master's degree in chemistry. I'm an occupational hygienist. I get confused by safety data sheets at times. Imagine how that is for someone in the workplace who doesn't have a background in safety, in hygiene, in chemistry, in any of those things. How difficult it can be to figure out what it is exactly you need to know in this information. And in terms of the information itself, because it is so highly technical and detailed, there's always the risk of error or omission, and how accurate is the information sometimes. So based on the Federal Hazardous Product Act inspections that occur, looking at labels and safety data sheets at various suppliers, up to 95% of safety data sheets and labels can contain errors. Now, they may not be significant errors. They may be more bureaucratic errors, but up to a quarter of those can be deemed as high risk. So that would imply there's some important information missing or inaccurate on that label. So again, it is very highly technical. It's very difficult to get that information right sometimes. And then you have issues with suppliers providing the proper information. So this comes from a safety data sheet, an older safety data sheet that had classified a product. You can see it's classified as carcinogen, irritant, corrosion, toxicity, everything there. Just a little while down the road in time, the safety data sheet gets updated and issued and now says it has no hazards. Why? How did this go from a carcinogen to a non-hazardous product? again, making sure that that information is available in the workplace and it is accurate is very difficult. So on to the perception of paperwork. Just to go back to the beginning, WHMIS is about providing health and safety information. There is a tendency to focus too much on the information as opposed to the providing. What I mean by that, it's easy to focus on keeping your safety data sheets up to date and making sure people are trained. And that is absolutely vital things to do, very important things to do. But at the end of the day, that information is only as good as it's being used on the shop floor, so to speak. So you have to be able to take that useful information and make sure it is given to the people who need to know. And speaking from a compliance perspective, compliance officers can be just as guilty of this as the employer in focusing too much on the paperwork. It's very easy to walk into an employer and say, hey, show me your safety data sheets, show me your training documents, and not take those extra steps to see how well it's implemented. In terms of education, and speaking from a Nova Scotia perspective, our legislation has we differentiate between education and training, whereas education is generic, training is the specific on site. So I'll try to stick to that paradigm, that model. But in terms of education, and again, just back to what we were speaking at before I started, it can be repetitive. It doesn't, it seems the same. It seems always to be the same old thing. It's just checking a box. It's generic and doesn't really focus on the things that you need to know in the workplace. These are the types of feedback that you'll get from people who do that training. This is worse as we've moved into online training, and I don't mean to dish online training. It is important. It is an effective way to provide training, but it makes it more difficult to get engagement when you're doing online training. I don't have an answer to this. It's good to hear that there is work being done on that to find ways to make it more engaging, to make it more relevant to people. So the generic training may be dry and not really effective. All too often the generic education, all too often the specific training that needs to be provided in the workplace is inadequate or just doesn't happen at all. So this is the list of what is required in workplace-specific training in Nova Scotia. It's very similar to what will be found in other jurisdictions. It's very difficult, again, to provide this to the employee sometimes, even though that information may be available in your safety data sheet and on your label, again, because it is complex and it requires someone to sit down and look at that information and be able to put it in a form that it's easily understood by everyone in the workplace. So in conclusion, I think as the original abstract for this talk talked about having some solutions to WHMIS. Unfortunately, it boils down to one slide at the end. But I think some key points here, for all that I've had to say, these are the three things I'd like you to take away. So first of all, the paperwork of the WHMIS is important. The safety data sheets, the training, the education. We can't have a WHMIS system without that. And it's good to have a standardized information system. But it's not the only WHMIS in your world. You need to focus that on the place where it really matters. And that's the folks working with hazardous products in the workplace. Find a way to make that paperwork relevant to them and easily understood to them through training, through education, through whatever it takes. And at the end of the day, question authority. As I alluded to, there's a lot of detailed technical information involved. There are errors, there are mistakes, and there are times that suppliers, again, just don't provide the information they need to. If you look at a label, a safety data sheet, information available, and you feel that isn't right, don't be afraid to ask. Push back, find a way to get the information that you need. And I would like to say thank you for your time today. And I will turn this back over to our host.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll invite anyone with questions to unmute themselves if they'd like to ask live or type it in the chat. I do notice there is someone writing in the chat, a great solution would be a legislative requirement for workers to read or know the safety data sheet before they use any product. I'm not familiar enough with the legislation to know if that's in there specifically. Is that something you can comment on, Chris, or?
It is implied, and I can only speak from the Nova Scotia perspective. It
Right,
is implied in there that the employees they have to be trained and
right.
educated before they work with hazardous products. Um, of course, all too often it is the cart before the horse situation.
That was my understanding for Ontario as well. And if anyone in the Ontario system knows otherwise, you are welcome to type in the chat or unmute yourself and correct me. But my understanding for Ontario was that they are supposed to know what they're working with. And that's more than just, or the intention is more than just, here's the SDS, here's where you find the hazard statements, but rather, how do you safely work with this chemical? As opposed to reading through the 10 pages, sometimes more, go, oh, I can't mix this with bleach. You should actually get that hands-on instruction or procedure or something else, but I know that far too often that's not happening. Holly says that I find the problem is there's so little information on the SDS, and when you call the manufacturer, they can't provide you with anything further. How do we solve this problem?
I don't have a good answer for you, unfortunately, Holly. The information on the SDS, it's laid out in the federal regulations, what is required. So the manufacturer is really providing just what they are mandated to do. The other issue is, of course, and this somewhat goes back to the comments I made around the welding wire and the engineered stone. Um, the manufacturer doesn't know how you're using it. They can provide kind of the scientific information, but in terms of how you use that in the workplace and anything specific that you might need to know around that, it's something beyond their ability and their knowledge to be able to deal with.
Okay. It does get tricky, and I think sometimes the SDS gets used as a legal document when that's not what the intention was. But when
Yep,
you start putting a legal document into it, it's used in purposes and ways you hadn't interpreted or planned when whoever was developing the original WHMIS developed it.
exactly.
Yeah. Any other questions? I'll do a last call. You're welcome to unmute or type it in the chat.
Sorry, and Steve Senka from Toronto. Food retail for 38 years, and the only Ontario requirement is to provide the safety data sheet. The training is based on understanding of the WHMIS system in general, rather than how to use each specific item. For example, in food retail, we had over 238 SDS sheets. So when I did as a joint health and safety committee member, when I did my inspections, I would ask people, where's the safety data sheet? Do you know how to use this product? Are you allowed to rinse your eyes with warm water or cold water? And 99% of the time, they didn't have a clue. So it's just, I just find there's this legislative hierarchy that says, yes, you have to have it, you have to know about it, but there's nothing that says before you touch a product, you have to read the safety data sheet. And it was like pulling teeth to get management to allow workers to do that. So that was kind of what the basis of that comment was. But thank you for your
Gotcha.
time.
Yep.
Yeah, and
Thanks,
I
Stephen.
know that Ontario has a lot in the general duty clauses. There's a general duty clause for employers and supervisors, and within this, there's, the employer must provide instruction and supervision to workers and take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances. And that makes employers, especially if small businesses, get confused or not realize what that means. Whereas, you could have 3 different inspectors go to 3 similar workplaces, and how they interpret that may be slightly differently depending on their sector or their focus at that time. And it's not to say the inspectors are doing a bad job, far from it. It's just to say that they're very broad statements, and then when it gets to court, you're going to have lawyers using those statements in different ways as well.
Yeah.
So it's
But
complex.
yeah, and that's a good point too, Stephen. I think you said 238 products. Just think of how difficult that is to make sure that people have the information on all 238 of those products to use them safely. WHMIS is not about, doing a half-hour training course and being pointed to the SDS binder. It's a lot of work, and to do it right requires a lot of work.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing to that? The
Sure.
absolute challenge of that was that we had over 10,000 listed items on the store shelves.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I kept telling people, no, you can't take it off the shelf. We know that works better and it may clean better, but you can't because we don't have a safety data sheet for that. So I agree the one of the greatest challenges is the disparity between retail and commercial retail and then industrial application, because it's just there's such a gap there. It's ridiculous. And then in the small business sector, involved in training, you go in there and they're just buying stuff at the Home Depot.
Yeah.
So they're like, I don't know, I bought it at the store, so why do I need to have this? And then they're totally lost. And then in the middle, the worker's just confused because they don't know which way
Yeah.
they're going. So again,
Mhm.
thank
Yep.
you for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You raised great points. Absolutely. And that ties in nicely with what you were talking about, Chris, the difference between the consumer products and the products intended for workplaces, slightly different labeling, slightly different terms, but it's the same thing inside.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
that would. Okay, I have someone saying, wouldn't it be great to add workplace first aid training to have additional training on reading SDS in there, how to respond to that in an emergency? That might garner more interest and engagement. I think that some training providers, I don't know about all, have some aspects of safety data sheets in their 2-day first aid course. Again, I haven't personally done all of them. I just know that in the one I did, there was a little bit of that last year, but I don't know if that's required or if that one just included it. I think, and it was very brief. I think that is definitely an interesting approach and could work really well. But then how much longer does that course end up getting?
That was I was going to quote someone that I know who's a first aid trainer. Is like, well, if you want to add something to the course, what do you want me to drop? Because there's only so much time in the day. But
Yep.
yeah, absolutely, it would. It is touched on, I believe, in the 2-day standard course, but I don't think
Yes.
it's discussed very much in the 1-day.
Okay, I did the 2-day standard and I added on for personal the child and infant, which made for very long days. So where would they add it exactly?
Yeah.
It becomes very tricky. CCOHS makes a statement that once a consumer product is used in the workplace, training and documentation must be the same as the WHMIS requirements, at least for federal. So I think that's, if it's not the case in every province, and again, we're focused on Ontario with OCAL, but I acknowledge there's people here from probably most, if not all the provinces and maybe even some territories. If it's not a requirement in your place, you should view it as due diligence to treat it all the same.
Yep. And it goes back to the where you're getting that information to train people if you don't have the information available.
Right, right, exactly. Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions, but I think that this is, this could be an ongoing conversation for hours. I think that this is an ongoing issue, and I really appreciate, Chris, that you took the time to come here today and give us this information. I'm definitely thinking about a lot of things I hadn't considered before. And it really led nicely from John's presentation earlier discussing what's going to be happening in Ontario in April.
And
So
just for everyone who's attending, that was not planned. So I think that was
I know
very, very good. It worked out very well.
it was
Ellie?
perfect. It's like we planned it.
Exactly. Well, thanks very much for the invitation, and I look
Thank you,
forward
Chris.
to the next discussion.